The following two words are an experiment. Do not be afraid. This is a test, and only a test. Advent Rising. Okay, one of two things have happened. Either you were hit with a wave of extreme depression, or you looked at your monitor and said, "What the fuck?" Right, well, if you're part of the former group, then I'm with you, all the way. But if you aren't aware of the game I just mentioned, then it is my sworn duty as one of the exalted ones to inform you. Prepare yourselves for the lost classic known as Advent Rising. Disclaimer, may not be a classic. Mathis may just be a big fanboy and is currently having issues with tightness in his pants. Now, before we get into the big questions as to why Advent Rising failed, who was responsible, if anyone, and why we never got more, let's talk about what made the prospect of this game so hard to resist. See, Advent Rising was created by Glyphix Games, and sadly was the company's one and only game. And Glyphix, before making games, made trailers and other videos for other media outlets. It was published by Majesco, whom after a number of financial losses in the gaming industry, why did no one buy Psychonauts? Has moved on to mobile and casual games. An interesting mix and a sad one to see end so quickly. The years leading up to Advent Rising's release were exciting. On paper, this had the makings of a masterpiece. It was a sci-fi story written by a famed sci-fi author, Orson Scott Card, the music of Tommy Tallarico, and hints that your choices would influence the story as it unfolded. Now, this may not sound big now, as famous names are all over every game, and choices in games are all but mandatory, but in 2005, this was new and exciting. The only games that had done this were big RPGs, and those weren't everyone's cup of tea. And a story written by Orson Scott Card, the man who gave us Ender's Game? Are you kidding me? My teenage self couldn't contain his excitement. I and the media devoured everything that could be seen and said about this game. It seemed to be a big jump in terms of storytelling and player involvement. So, after a couple years, 2005 finally rolls around, and the closer we got to May, the more and more excited I got. And then, one fateful day, I went and purchased Advent Rising. And I loved it. The story of Advent Rising snatched me up immediately. You play as Gideon With, voiced by Will Friedle, best known for Eric Matthews on Boy Meets World. He and a few others are escorting human ambassadors to meet with a race of aliens known as Aurelians. In this meeting, it's revealed that the Aurelians worship the human race as gods, and they have the potential to evolve and develop powers beyond anything that's capable within the known universe. This hidden potential is hinted at, but said it will come in time and that the future of the universe may indeed rest on humanity's shoulders one day. And then, after all the handshakes and high fives with the humans saying, "Sweet, we're gonna be superheroes, I wanna be Batman," the Aurelians crash the party with the next bit of news. There's another alien race out there known as the Seekers, and they want to eradicate humanity because of this gift they possess, and to be wary and careful should they find you. Upon leaving the meeting and arriving back at the space station they departed from, as if upon command of plot, the Seekers arrive, and eradication begins immediately. With a narrow escape, Gideon crashes into a nearby planet after making a fateful decision on whom he has to save. He has to choose between his girlfriend and his brother. One lives, one dies. This choice would come back to haunt him later in the game. So, if this game had a solid story thrusting the plot forward and keeping the player involved, what held the game back? What was its problem? Well, the only two things to look at are graphics and gameplay. And the first we're going to see is the graphics of the game. Now, graphically, the game still holds up pretty well today, which is surprising. Using a cartoon stylistic art choice with hints of some cell shading, the simple but defined look of the game brought to mind sci-fi cartoons like the Iron Giant or Atlantis and so on. Animations were smooth and the setting consistently changed, making sure the player never was looking at the same level over and over again. So variety wasn't this game's weak point. Textures looked and held up reasonably well, and the guns and powers you would eventually wield felt decent enough. The misstep came in form of the gameplay. If you go and you read the critics' reviews for the game, a lot of what I've said holds true. When we come to the gameplay, it's where we see the real split. Either the game is lauded for its exceptional story and its fun gameplay and how great it actually is and receives a high score, or it gets a relatively mediocre to low score because of its gameplay, even though it has a great story and decent graphics. See, Advent Rising came into the gameplay arena with some great ideas. At its core, it was a third-person shooter, but this was before the days where over-the-shoulder cam was the norm. It was slightly more pulled back, showing the entirety of the character. But aside from guns, Gideon had psychic abilities at his disposal. Everything from telekinesis to generating a psychic shield to protect him from damage. But the game implemented something I still wish I saw in more games today. It had a leveling mechanic attached to these abilities, but not one where you spent points and leveled what you liked. No, instead, the abilities you used most leveled on their own, becoming more and more powerful as you continued using them. Perhaps throwing enemies around the battlefield was your favorite tactic. Initially, you can only pick up and move one of them. Later in the game, the more you used it, you would eventually be able to pick up 3 or 4 and toss them miles away, taking them out of combat completely. It felt natural, and it felt powerful. It created a natural evolutionary feel to the powers, along with flowing naturally into the story of Gideon evolving into the special creature the Aurelians viewed humans as. And almost universally, the critics agreed. The real big point of contention came in the gunplay and the targeting system. See, Advent Rising implemented a few features that generally felt out of place. The first was the inclusion of a Max Payne-esque slow-mo dodge feature. Though it worked reasonably well, it didn't feel necessary amidst all the guns and powers sitting at Gideon's disposal. But the biggest war on what was otherwise a gorgeous face, was the inclusion of something they called flick targeting. Or as I like to call it, it's 2005 and we're still trying to figure out the best way to make a third-person shooter. What flick targeting essentially allowed was the quick flick of the right thumbstick, which would auto-target the closest threatening enemy, freeing up other buttons on the control pad and allowing other things to be mapped to them. More weapons, more powers, more grenades, etc. On paper, it sounded great. I mean, all I have to do is move the right thumbstick and I'm auto-targeted? Sounds easy. But the implementation was exceptionally poor. It never quite worked the way you wanted it to, sometimes skipping the enemy you were going for and targeting one a few feet to a side, or worse, targeting one far off in the background that wasn't even a threat yet. This led to frustrating battles and unnecessary deaths, and in a game where fast-paced combat was the norm, the targeting system is absolutely essential and needs to work correctly. Add that to a buggy launch with some glaring game-breaking bugs including freezing cutscenes, random game-ending glitches, and outright game crashes, and you can see why Advent Rising fared at about a normal 68 average with the critics. The game seemed to suffer from the classic, not enough time in development, but let's get this puppy out the door syndrome, and sadly, though it was bursting with potential, it didn't sell well. But if you could get past the bugs and the admittedly bad flick targeting system, you had a very unique, fun, and interesting shooter. At this point in gaming, we started to see a bigger emergence of stories within the medium. Games were straying further and further away from being mindless and becoming more and more about interactive storytelling experience. Advent Rising went out of its way to do so, and for attempting it was a fairly unique and, as I said, fun experience with some notable flaws. Additionally, it was set to be a trilogy of games with a huge overarching story to what could potentially explore different planets and more powers as the games went on. Unfortunately, with a relatively mediocre critic reception and poor sales, Majesco and Glyphix canned the next two, leaving the fans with an unfortunate and very big cliffhanger. Donald Mustard, who was one of the original developers of Advent Rising, now is the chairman of Chair Entertainment, creators of the awesome Shadow Complex, has gone on record saying he'd love to be able to make another Advent Rising and finish the trilogy and story of the game, and if it were up to him, he'd be doing that now. But that quote comes from 2009, and the likelihood of seeing an ending to the Advent trilogy is smaller and smaller each passing year. Factor in that it's an 8-year-old game and a fan base that's already too small, a reintroduction to the series would be almost necessary. And a little less than a year after the original game would launch, we would see Advent Rising ported to the PC via Steam, with most of its bugs fixed, some spit shine and polish added. It was better received, hitting an average of about a 72, a solid 4 points higher than its previous console iteration, But unfortunately, it was not enough. Glyphix would shut down shortly after. With Psychonauts having released the month prior, we all know just what happened to the ill-fated Majesco publishing company. But if you have the spare money and the time, I urge you, if you've never played Advent Rising, to give it a chance. Though you may have a hard time finding an original Xbox copy, a Steam copy will only run you $10 and provide you with about 8 to 10 hours of gameplay and a story for you to enjoy. The world is rich, the design is colorful and fun, and maybe, just maybe, you'll join the ranks of Advent Rising fans out there. We may never get a finished trilogy, but we can enjoy what little time we have with the original. Advent Rising. Killed in action.